Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, where we are going to talk about how to run migrated BizTalk workloads on premises using Logic Apps. I have with me, David Robinson, Principal Consultant with us, who's going to do the bulk of this presentation. So, Dave, would you like to just take us through let's just do the first couple of intro things, and
Yeah.
and then I'll hand over.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So the So today's session, you don't really need to be immensely technical, although we are going to just go into a bit of nuts and bolts about how things work. But what we are going to do is have a small amount of slides, and then we're going to do quite a lot of demo. And so it's really just a bit of a hands-on how all this stuff fits together through demonstration rather than just blinding you with slideware. So hopefully that's all right. Hopefully that's what you want to hear because it's a practical how do you do this session. The other thing is, we'd absolutely love it if you ask questions. We are having a problem with the LinkedIn feed, but if you're on the GoToWebinar feed, there is a questions button at the top. Please post your questions there, and we will get back. I'll just make a note on that. Oh, I've just done a typo on that as well, but please post your questions at any time, and we'll go through those later on. So should we move on, Dave?
Yeah.
Okay, and so previous one. What we're going to talk about is what Dave's going to mostly go through is the hybrid deployment model. A lot of it is going to be demo, like we said. We're going to talk about some strategies for migration, some of the deployment and management best practices, and some of the things to think about. Just practical considerations, because as we get into this, you kind of understand that this hybrid solution that Microsoft has just released is very, very opinionated. It's its own thing, and you have to kind of understand how it works to get the best out of it. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So, without further ado, Dave, do you want to talk about the hybrid deployment
Yeah,
model?
sure. Yeah. So thanks, Andrew, and welcome everyone. So at first, I just want to talk through the approach to deploying Logic Apps on premises. So one thing to point out here really is it's not fully on premises in that much of this will still run in Azure in the control plane, and by a control plane, the ARM template operations of deploying things, the monitoring of your applications and so on, all of that's still done through the Azure portal. So you're not taking the whole of Azure and running it on-prem to run your Logic Apps. You're taking a portion of the runtime to allow you to run it on premises. So you're still going to control and manage your environment through the Azure portal. That's the key thing here. As part of the hybrid approach, the on-prem part of this is some form of Kubernetes cluster. Now, there's many different distributions of Kubernetes. OpenShift is probably the one that most people know about, but there's many distributions. And the key requirement here is as long as they work with Azure Arc, then you can deploy your Logic Apps on premises. For the purpose of the demo today, I don't have an on-prem Kubernetes environment, so I'm using AKS. So whilst it's running in the cloud, it's still a Kubernetes environment. So once you've got your on-prem environment, you've then got your Logic Apps that will run within your Kubernetes cluster. So this is a diagram taken from the Microsoft documentation, and it summarizes how we're deploying here today. A couple of extra things for your on-prem environment that you need to take into account. You need a SQL database to store your run history. So like in running Logic Apps natively in Azure, you've got run history and so on, inputs and outputs and message tracking and so on. All of that in your on-prem environment is stored in SQL Server. Now you can run SQL Server on-prem, or you could run SQL Azure if you wanted to. So if you wanted to run your logic apps strangely on-prem in Kubernetes, but somehow connect to an external SQL database, then you could do that. But you're more likely to want to have an on-prem SQL environment, or you may already have one that you can reuse and create a new database to host your run history. Likewise, you need to have a file share, so an SMB file share, and many on-prem environments will probably have an SMB file share, and that's used to store the artifacts, the workflows, and so on. When I get into the demo, I'll show what does that actually mean. And you've also got the option for, and we'll mention this a little bit later on, but you've also got the option for open telemetry. So whilst you're going to monitor your logic apps and your workflows through the Azure portal, you can export some of that to open telemetry platforms. So why would you want to do this? Well, you might want to migrate your BizTalk environment away from BizTalk for license support reasons and so on, but you might still want to connect to your on-prem applications. So you might have mainframe systems, you may have backend systems. So rather than migrating your BizTalk workload to Azure directly, natively, all of the complications that involves in terms of networking from Azure to on-prem, you might not want to do that. So you might still want to maintain connectivity to your on-prem applications. You might have regulatory and compliance reasons. For whatever reason, you may need to keep your customers' data or your applications within your own data center. Or you may want at some point to run multi-cloud. So you could, in theory, run your logic apps on multiple different cloud platforms that support Kubernetes and connect them via Azure Arc. So you may decide to do that because you may have some customers, if you're building some sort of SaaS platform, you may have some customers that want to run on different cloud environments. So how do you run Kubernetes? Well, you need an Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster. You can run that on Azure Local, or you can run it on Windows Server. Again, the details of this is in the Microsoft documentation, so I won't really go into that. You still do need the Azure portal, as I mentioned, for the control plane aspects in terms of monitoring and deploying and so on, ARM templates. If you lose access to your internet connection, your workloads, of course, will still run. They'll still run in the on-prem Kubernetes environment. So you're not losing any data. It just means that you won't be able to view the run history whilst you've lost your internet connection. But of course, when your internet connection comes back, you'll be able to go in and view the run history. And the other important consideration as well, really, so whilst you're running on-prem and you'll be paying for licenses and you'll be paying for your TIN and any SQL licenses, for example, it doesn't mean that you're then not charged any additional amounts. So when you run Azure Arc connecting to your Kubernetes cluster, you are still charged for executions of your vCores in your on-prem environment. So you need to take that into account, that it's not taking away any billing from Microsoft's perspective, in that whereas before, if you were running purely in the cloud and you were charged for your app service plans and so on, you are still going to be charged a certain amount of money for running your applications on premises. So that's just a little bit about the hybrid deployment model, how it works and so on. So I'm kind of going to just jump straight into the demo, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it, Dave.
So what I'm going to talk about first is, just as a refresher, when we done our first BizTalk to Azure migration, I talked about some BizTalk applications, and I had a simple employee application and a simple invoice application. And in the previous webinar, we talked about how to migrate that to run in Azure. And we talked about reusing artifacts from BizTalk, so primarily the schemas and the maps. What we're going to do today is basically run these logic apps in Kubernetes and reuse those same artifacts. Now, I've already set this up because I didn't want to go through the actual act of creating a workflow and importing all the resources today, because we've kind of done that on previous webinars. But I just wanted to highlight that we're building on the previous webinar of using the BizTalk artifacts. So if I go over here to my browser, the first thing I just wanted to show was, if I've got the right tab open, is my Kubernetes environment. So in my AKS, my Kubernetes environment, which is simulating my on-prem environment, I've got, I just wanted to highlight a few things. So when you deploy and configure your Kubernetes environment to run Logic Apps, there's a few things it installs, and mainly the Logic Apps namespace, and that deploys a number of different pods that support the running Logic Apps in Kubernetes. So you see there's a whole host of app container pods that are running to support the ability to run Logic Apps. The other aspect of this is the thing that you need to consider is the scaling. So at the moment, I've got a node pool. And again, I'm not going to talk too much detail about how Kubernetes works, but people may or may not know how it works, but I'm not going to talk in too much detail about that. So I have a node pool. My node pool has 4 nodes at the moment. You do need, when running AKS in Azure to support Logic Apps, you do need a minimum of 4 nodes, because when you look at the nodes and you look at the, you can configure the scaling to scale to more. When you look at the resource usage across Kubernetes in AKS, it takes up quite a lot of resources. So you could just about get away with running it in 3 nodes, but it means your Logic Apps might be quite slow because it's not really getting access to the resources it needs. So that's Kubernetes really. That's my Kubernetes environment, which is me simulating an on-prem environment. So I've already installed and configured that. That's mentioned in this Microsoft document, and it's quite detailed, so I'm not going to really go through every step, but Andrew is going to paste some links into that. It's the sort of thing that you need to put quite a lot of thought into setting it up, and there's quite a lot of steps and so on. But again, I'm not going to go through every step of that. But I just wanted to highlight the Kubernetes environment that I built. So going into the BizTalk part of it, when we've done our first webinar, migrating BizTalk to Azure, I built these workflows here, receiving an employee data and sending it to a HR system and sending it to a payroll system. And we talked about how we reused many of the BizTalk artifacts that we might have. So we've got schemas. So again, we had all the schemas and maps. Now, I'm going to reuse those schemas exactly the same as they were in native Azure. But first, before I do that, I'm just going to run a message through my environment. So this is just a simple employee message, which is going to go off and go through my send employee HR. So you can see here, we've had an execution of that workflow, and we've got a send employee to a payroll system. So I'm just simulating a very, very straightforward pub sub approach, whereby one message is published to 2 destination systems. And for the purpose of the demo, when we done the first webinar, that was published to just a storage account, again, just to simulate an on-prem type approach, whereby you might have a file share or you might have a destination system. I don't have a destination system, so I was simulating sending it to blob storage. So I've got 2 messages that have been sent out. Now, when you come to do this in hybrid approach, it looks very, very similar. So here's my hybrid logic app. Now, before I show you the details of this one, I'm just going to show you how you would create a new one, because it is slightly different. So I go into the portal, I go to logic app, let's get rid of that. And I just click on create. You see there's a new option for hybrid. So whereas before you'd be able to select logic apps consumption if you're still doing that, or a normal workflow service plan or an app service environment, there's a new option for hybrid deployment. So I'll just select that. And from there, like before, you specify your details about your logic apps, specify the work resource group, and so on. If I just give that a name here, the key differentiation.
While you're just doing this,
Andrew.
Dave, quick question to clarify on that, because is there any change to the Logic Apps project from a development perspective, or is it merely from an infrastructure perspective that people are going to notice? I mean, if you create a Logic App solution to run on an Azure hosting plan, could that same solution then be deployed on the Kubernetes, or are they different in terms of the actual developer experience?
They'll be different from the point of view of if you had, so if I go over to this one here, so this is my native Azure one, and I look at my receiving employee data. So I just type employee so I can filter that out. One of the things you need to consider within your native Azure environment is, are you trying to port it over directly? Now, in my native Azure, I'm sending messages to Service Bus.
Mm-hmm.
So whilst you could run these workflows directly in hybrid on-prem, you may not want a connection to Service Bus in Azure because you can't run Service Bus on-prem at the moment. I don't think Microsoft really have any plans to support that. But if you were building a set of logic apps and you were depending heavily on Azure resources such as Service Bus or
Yeah.
storage or any native Azure resource, and you were trying to port your logic apps direct to hybrid, you'd have to consider whether you want to allow that. So you'd have to open up network connections to Azure and for Service Bus and so on, all the VNet routing and
They
so on.
still work. They still theoretically work. It's just
Yeah,
it's, it's just you've got a whole load of you've got the network and security kind of aspects to it.
yeah, that's right.
But if you were just going to connect to Service Bus, you'd probably just be hosting them in Azure anyway.
Yeah. So going back to creating the logic app and how it's different to creating a normal Azure native logic app, you select your region that you've deployed your Kubernetes cluster into, or Azure Arc, and it will determine whether you've got an app connected environment. And that's basically you saying that you've configured Azure Arc to talk to your on-prem Kubernetes cluster. Now you then get to configure the storage settings, and I'm not going to go through this, but that's when you point your connection string to your SQL environment. So you just paste in your connection string there. You specify your host name, which would be your SMB file share. For the purpose of what my demo is going to show, not in there, but one moment. I've actually simulated an SMB file share by creating a file share in Azure again. So if you are like me, demoing this or building this with some Azure resources, you'd specify your SMB file share, you'd specify your path. So I'll just paste that, and then you specify your username and password, and then you click create, and it would go off and create your logic app. It'll take a few moments to create, but under the covers, what it's going to be doing, if I go off to my Kubernetes environment and look at my namespace, if I look in my logic apps namespace, if I'd click deploy, you'd start to see another set of pods for my logic app. So I've got a logic app here, LA AIS hybrid webinar. So that's deploying my logic app into my Kubernetes cluster. And if I was clicking create here, that's what it would go off and do. It would use all of the different extensions it's already installed to provision the application in the Kubernetes cluster. But that takes a few moments. So I'm just going to actually go back here and use my one I've already created. So this is the logic app that I previously deployed. And again, it looks very similar to what you might expect. So if I just go back to here, so you've got your usual view. The difference here is you can see that it's in a custom location and it's a connected environment. So that's kind of showing you that it's the hybrid approach. If I look through my workflows, again, you've got your workflows that are deployed and created. And like before, you've got your artifacts and schemas. So I've already uploaded my schemas and my maps, like in the previous webinar. Now, what's important to note here is these artifacts are all stored in your file share. So if I go to my file share I've already built, you see within your file share here, you've got your artifacts. So I've got my maps and schemas, and that's basically where it's going to access those resources from. And likewise, the workflows that I've created, that's where they're stored. That's where the workflow file is actually stored. So that's it all deployed. Again, I've reused all of those BizTalk artifacts. I've created a very simple representation of my BizTalk application, like I did do for the previous one. And as you can see, I've had a few running instances here. So I'm just going to do another running instance. So I start another instance and I'll send that on. What we should get over here is, hopefully, is it 221? It is 221. So you see I receive employee workflow has run. And like with normal native logic apps, you can see your actual run history. I'll come on to this little bit here in a moment. But fundamentally, what I should have, as I've run the demo, if I go back to upper level, in my file share, in my native demo, I sent out messages to the blob storage, but I've got a file share output here. So we should see, oh yeah, that's UTC time. So we should see a new file that's appeared for my HR system, and we should see a new file that's appeared for my payroll system. So the new file has appeared at 1321, but that's UTC time, so it's actually 221 now. So I've got a working BizTalk migration in hybrid logic apps. I wanted to go through some of the considerations really now. So we talked about service bus previously in the setup. You could configure your on-prem to talk to service bus, but if you're maintaining an on-prem environment and you're building your logic apps on-prem, you're unlikely to want to then take advantage of service bus in Azure and run that. So what I've actually done, which Microsoft now support as connectors for logic apps hybrid, I've built my own messaging platform using RabbitMQ. So I've actually done that by deploying RabbitMQ into my Kubernetes cluster. So again, in the links that Andrew's going to share, there's details on how to do that. But fundamentally, I've deployed the RabbitMQ operator and the workload into my Kubernetes cluster. So if I go back to my Kubernetes cluster here, go back to my namespaces, you should see a RabbitMQ namespace, and that's got the RabbitMQ operator. So I've got RabbitMQ running in my same Kubernetes cluster. And again, you can scale that as you might need to in a production environment. I've just got one instance of it running. But what I've actually done here is created a very simple, the equivalent of a service bus topic and subscription. So I've created an employee queue, HR queue, and an employee payroll queue. And when I send the message, it goes to both of those. So much like PubSub with Azure and service bus topics and subscriptions, you create a number of queues, but you create something called an exchange, and your exchange is effectively the fan out point. So in this case, a message is sent to an exchange in Web.
Like being able to have multiple subscriptions kind of thing.
Yeah, it's the equivalent of having multiple subscriptions. So my exchange, you can see here, it's a fan out exchange where it sends it to employee DR, employee HR, and employee payroll. So they're my three queues. And that's the equivalent, of a topic subscription. Now, we should see that if I send another message to show that it's actually sending to RabbitMQ and it's not smoke and mirrors, if I send another message, we should see. So whilst there's 0 in employee HR and an employee payroll, because those have been consumed by the workflows that I have running in hybrid mode, you should see the employee DR, which was my backup one. The number of messages has increased there. So again, you can go into that and you can get the messages and you can look at them. But this demo is not really too much about RabbitMQ, but fundamentally, it's about having a messaging engine that you can run on-prem that isn't service bus. So I've set that up. It's fairly straightforward to set up, install the operator, install the workload, and then you've got to just make some security changes because the guest account is unprotected when you configure Kubernetes. And you use this as your connection string fundamentally. So you've got a connection string that you're going to reuse later on. So in my logic apps then, running in hybrid mode, if I go into some of these. So like a normal logic app, I'm receiving a HTTP request. I'm validating the message with my XML schema. So like native logic apps, I'm picking the schema and it selects the files that you've deployed into the artifacts, which is the file share. I'm doing a transformation, and the difference here, of course, is I'm sending to RabbitMQ. So you create your connection to RabbitMQ, you put your connection string in, and again, I'm not going to go into the detail of setting that up, but fundamentally, what I'm doing here is sending a message to RabbitMQ. So I'm sending it to that exchange called employee, and that's going to deliver the message via the fan out to those 3 queues. And
Yeah,
as
because
we saw in
previously
the
we just had a center service bus previously, didn't we? But this is
that's
pretty much exactly the same, except all I've done is change that one action from being a sender service bus to being a sender RabbitMQ.
exactly. So if we look at the run history, then of course you can see the message has been sent to RabbitMQ, and all the same views that you can get when running it natively, so you can get the input and the output. Now, so when the message is sent to RabbitMQ, I've got two what I would call off ramps: send to HR and send to payroll. So if we look at one of those, you're probably guessing what this is going to look like, but it's very, very similar in that rather than having a HTTP trigger, I've got a RabbitMQ trigger. So these triggers, the RabbitMQ triggers and the actions, these are something Microsoft have released recently. So these are quite new triggers and actions to support RabbitMQ. So you can see here, I've got my connection to RabbitMQ. I'm basically telling it which queue that I want to receive messages from. And then I'm doing the same as before, basically transforming my XML using one of my BizTalk maps. And in my other workflow, again, it's quite similar. I'll go into that one. I'm transforming my XML using the BizTalk map, but I'm also doing flat file encoding and finally sending the files to the file share. So if you've got a complex set of flat files that you want to reuse, then like before, you can use that encode flat file to send a flat file, or even you can receive a flat file using the decode flat file. Again, using all of the artifacts that you might get from your BizTalk environment. So if I just go back to here, I don't think I did show this. So yeah, I've sent a message in. It's been picked up by the subscriber via RabbitMQ, and it's sent the message. So this one's a flat file. So if I open up that one, we'll see it's a flat file. And if I look at my HR system, I should see it is XML. So I've got 2 different off ramps. One sending XML that's mapped from the canonical XML, and one that's sending a flat file that's been mapped and converted from the canonical message. So that's fundamentally running logic apps in hybrid mode in Azure, but via Kubernetes. So I've demoed exactly the same as running logic apps natively, other than service bus. I don't have this BAM tracking. That was the demo Turbo 360. I've not implemented that for my hybrid logic apps. But quite easily, you can build a migration path from BizTalk to hybrid using Kubernetes. So that's the demo part of it, really. I'm just going to go back to the slides, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, just while you're changing over the slides, it's just the thing that strikes me about this as you're going through this is that there's a big infrastructure piece to this in terms of getting the Kubernetes cluster set up, getting it Arc enabled, and getting everything right so that you can deploy onto it. However, once you've done that, it's amazing how the rest of the experience is just like any other Logic Apps experience. So
That's correct. Yeah, it's the same developer experience. It's the same look and feel. The monitoring it is the same. So I didn't really show too much other than the workflow run history. But if you look at one of the workflow runs, it's all the same visual representation. And I think Microsoft have worked really hard to make it the same. So whilst you're running it on-prem and it's running in Kubernetes, they've worked really hard to make it look exactly the same. So that you might have some workloads running in Azure natively, and you might have some running on-prem because they're connecting to a back-end system that for whatever reason you don't want to expose over the internet. So what's really good about this approach is they both look the same. You can view them the same, you can monitor them the same, and so on.
yeah, so even though you've got SQL Server for your run history, that is actually just there's a background process that's uploading that into Azure. So so that it all ultimately you're just monitoring it all in Azure in the same way that you would anything else.
Yeah.
Which comes
Yeah.
back to what we were saying about Azure being the control plane. That
Yeah.
that's where your center of operations is in the
Yeah.
Azure portal, and then you're just running a workload. You're almost your on-prem cluster is just running dark, and you're just managing that from Azure.
Yeah. So I just wanted to talk about some key migration strategies. So if you're deciding to migrate away from BizTalk because end of support, or you don't want to renew your licenses and so on for another year, but you are still wanting to run on-prem, just a few things to consider. So building a Kubernetes environment on-prem is quite time consuming, and there's lots to consider in terms of understanding your load and your capacity and the networking and so on. But if you want to start migrating your workload away from BizTalk, what is it, or what's the option? Well, you can wait for your Kubernetes cluster to be built, at which point you're waiting a period of time, depending on the turnaround of provisioning the tin and provisioning the networking and so on. Or the other option, which I think is probably recommended, is start to build your hybrid logic apps, but deploy them to AKS so you can start to build and test them and so on. So don't wait for your full-on environment to be built. Start thinking about deploying to AKS to make sure you can build and test them and so on. And you might even also want to have a sandbox environment or a dev environment that you don't want to run on a separate Kubernetes cluster. You could still run AKS in that way and simulate some backend systems, for example. So it's a consideration about waiting for your environment to be built, whether you pause the building of your actual code base or you start building your code in a simulated environment, which is the same as what I've done here. And we've already talked about there's no on-prem service bus, so you've got to consider alternatives. So I've demoed RabbitMQ, but you can also run on Kafka. And again, what's key to this, the effort that you put into building your Kubernetes cluster isn't just going to be for logic apps. Any of these middleware platforms, RabbitMQ, Kafka, and any other systems you might want to take advantage of, you can run those in your Kubernetes cluster as well, which is like what I've done for our RabbitMQ. Just a few little pieces on deployment. So deploying for a POC, like normal logic apps running in Azure, you can deploy via VS Code. So there's some detailed instructions again on the Microsoft documentation for that. You can build from the portal, which is what I've done for the purpose of this demo. So I created my 3 simple workflows using the portal. And from a deployment perspective, you can deploy via Azure CLI. Your CI/CD options, there is support for zip deployment, and Microsoft have mentioned they're about to publish details of how to incorporate, publish into your Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster from CI/CD. It's fundamentally going to be just a different set of steps to go into your YAML pipeline, but we're still waiting for that article to be published, and that will be published somewhere in the Azure Integration Services blog. So keep an eye out for that. Monitoring, you can continue to monitor your workflows in the portal. I think what is a good option here is that Microsoft have really put thought into is if you're running a Kubernetes environment, running multiple workloads, be it Logic Apps or Java or any other systems, what seems to be a common requirement these days with multiple different platforms is a common approach to telemetry data. So Microsoft have given the option for being able to export your telemetry data to open telemetry. So you can have your Java applications published into that. You can have your hybrid logic apps published into that. And then you can view all of your applications in one central view that allows you to put a view over the top of the open telemetry resources. And then finally, just wanted to highlight some of the links to some of the things I mentioned. So I think Andrew's got copies of these links that he's going to paste in the chat.
Yeah, they've all been posted in the chat as we've gone through, so please just put that. But if you're going to be watching this offline or later on the playback, I will also put those in the description.
Yeah. So just to give a summary of what these references are. So the first one is the announcement of hybrid logic apps being generally available, and that's kind of where the diagram comes from. There's also, sorry, that's the announcement of it being GA, apologies. The setting up your own infrastructure is where the diagram comes from, and that goes through the detailed steps of running various Azure CLI commands to set up your Azure Arc, to deploy AKS, or if you're not using AKS, then you'll obviously have to substitute how to build your Kubernetes cluster. There's a link to how to use OpenTelemetry, and then finally, if you were wanting to do what I've done and use RabbitMQ as your messaging engine, there's a link to the cluster operator for RabbitMQ to run that on Kubernetes. It literally is just 2 commands that I ran to get my RabbitMQ deployed into my Kubernetes cluster. And that's it, really. It was quite a quick demo, but hopefully it's been quite useful to show how you can migrate from BizTalk to on-prem using Logic Apps. The key thing is reusing your artifact, your schemas and your maps, and building workflows that look kind of similar to what your BizTalk orchestrations might look like. That's it from me, Andrew.
Thanks for that, Dave. Well, do you know what? Something weird has happened. I've just lost my my notes that I was going to that I was just noting down some questions I was going to ask. But the first one is that we often talk about using Azure functions and Logic Apps, and there's some cases where you can use each. So where do functions fit in with the hybrid model? Because I think they can be run in containers as well, but I don't.
Yeah. So the key thing here is, if I can find my mouse pointer's gone. If I come out of here and I go to my Kubernetes cluster, go to here. This platform here that I'm running my Logic Apps in, fundamentally it's running on the Azure Functions runtime. So I haven't got an example of that running, but you could deploy your functions. I believe I haven't tried it, but I believe you can deploy it to your Kubernetes cluster in the same way. It might be a good follow-on session that we can build and demonstrate as an add-on, or publish a video on that. But I believe you can. I've not tried it myself, but the key focus for the migration is running Logic Apps. But if you've got pipeline components, then yes, you should be able to run those in your same Kubernetes environment.
And I suppose the other thing from that is that you can, within a Logic Apps workspace, i.e. Logic Apps project, you can have functions there. So presumably they would work if you were just using the function embedded in your Logic Apps workspace as a bit of code. I think that would work. There's another thing that you mentioned about running the Kubernetes cluster, and do they need to be Windows nodes on Kubernetes, or does this all run under Linux? Do you know whether that's actually mentioned in the documentation anywhere?
Yes, you can run a Linux image. Oh no, that's for, actually it's a very good point. Let me check my actual there it was. Ubuntu Linux, yeah. So my node pool is running Ubuntu Linux, yeah. So the Logic Apps are running on, well, good question. I hadn't even considered that, to be honest.
Yeah, the default is just, well, Ubuntu is kind of a default Linux anyway, isn't it? So
yeah.
So is it, so when you talk, also one of the things, just to expand on a little bit, is the charging model, because you would kind of think that if you were spinning up your own Kubernetes cluster and running workloads on it, then you're paying for all your runtime with that. But obviously, one of the things we said is that there is a charge associated with with this, and I just want to sort of elaborate on this a little bit, because as we've seen, there's a whole load of data has to go up to the portal and be stored and managed, and that kind of thing. And so, yeah, when you're talking about having charges, it's because there is actually a lot of work going on behind the scenes in Azure that
Yeah,
is actually
yeah.
that actually needs to happen in order for your workloads to run. So that's why there is a charge. But one of the things I was just going to clarify is does that apply to any Azure Arc enabled cluster, or is there a specific Logic Apps charge?
So if I go into the pricing calculator and I select Azure Arc, you've got a whole host of things that you're going to be charged on. There's a base price for Azure Arc enabled servers. There's obviously, if you've got
Yeah.
Arc enabled SQL Server, there's costs associated with that. But if I come down to this section here, which I've scrolled past, my Arc enabled Kubernetes, based on the number of vCPUs in my Kubernetes cluster. So I just select that. I'll go and look at my Kubernetes cluster. I think I've got I think I've got 12 virtual CPUs. So I've got, if I was running this on-prem and I had 12 vCores, and I put that into my pricing calculator there, you see I'm going to be charged an amount. So yes, it is any Kubernetes cluster running through Azure Arc. Of course, the only way of supporting Logic Apps running on-prem is via Azure Arc. So there is that cost consideration, like I mentioned. So
Yeah,
if you're
but
running
it's
open,
not Logic Apps. It's actually your Kubernetes, your Arc enabled cluster that you're paying for,
yeah, yeah,
rather
you're
than
you're
the
not
Logic
paying
Apps
for your
themselves.
yeah, you're not paying for the equivalent of the app service plan that you might have been when running Logic Apps natively in Azure. You're paying for the management of your Kubernetes cluster via Azure Arc via the control plane. And the way they've decided to price that is based on the number of virtual CPUs you've got in your cluster and the amount of execution and so on. So you do need to take that into account, and you do need to take into account your workloads and so on to understand the price. Don't just assume connect our environment we've already built. You will need to figure out your pricing model and understand how that's going to impact you.
So the other thing I think, and this is just for uh, again for people that are unfamiliar with how all this fits together, because what I mean, I don't know how many people are actually running Kubernetes out there. I mean, Kubernetes has been around a long time, but it's actually a bit of a significant infrastructure investment to go down the
Yeah,
Kubernetes route. There are great paybacks if you go down that route later on, but it's a big investment kind of up front to do that.
yeah,
But when people configure workloads running Kubernetes, they all think about containers. And one of the things we've had here is we haven't mentioned containers at all. So it'd be, I think it'd be useful for us to just elaborate a little bit on that, because obviously behind the scenes, something's running in a container. I think it's just the fact that is actually all abstracted from us when we
yeah.
by creating the
So,
plan.
so if I go into my namespace and I find my Logic Apps namespace here, if I look at my Logic App that I've deployed, you should see I've got one pod running here. So that's my Logic App, my hybrid webinar O1 Logic App running in a container on 3 pods. So if I go into that, you can see I've got on a pod, I've got the proxy, the Kubernetes proxy and the Envoy service, and I've actually got my container that's running on each of those pods. So if I look into my container, you can see the actual details of that container and where its persistent volume is. The persistent volume, of course, is the file share. So like you can
Mm-hmm.
view in any Kubernetes deployment, you've just got fundamentally, you've got a container, a Logic Apps container running on a
And
series of pods, which can
and
scale.
this is kind of interesting thing of how this fits together, because you've got a generic Logic Apps container, and
Yeah,
but your Logic App is in that SMB file share. So effectively, your container with its by its configuration is calling out to load that
yeah.
um, to load effectively your logic app zip file into it and run it. But you don't need to build a container for this. It's a standard container, but the way it all hangs together, that container pulls in your logic app and runs it, which is a really interesting way of configuring this application. But it'd just be useful to sort of point out to them that you don't have to, you don't have to actually be building logic apps containers and figuring out how to deploy them in pods. That's all kind of handled by the design time experience.
Yeah, that's all handled via the extension. When you set up your Azure Arc enabled cluster, you install a container apps extension, and that takes care of deploying your logic apps and building the containers for you. So that's where Microsoft have put the extra effort in. You don't have to build your own container. You don't have to create your Docker file or whatever, however you're going to deploy it. You fundamentally deploy the logic app in the same way you deploy it to Azure. So Microsoft have built a layer over the top of it to make that developer experience the same as if you were doing logic apps in native Azure.
So, and finally, I think this might be something we can drill into at a later point, but it's just, have you got any initial thoughts, Dave, about performance of this relative to other ways of running logic app standard?
So there is a detailed article on performance. Some of the things to consider, of course, would be your how many nodes in your node pool, how many replica sets, and also within your logic apps as well. If I go into my settings here and look at my containers, you've got to consider your workload and understand, based on your workload, what resource allocation do you need to give to your container. So for example, at the moment, my container, my logic apps container, LA-AIS hybrid webinar 01, is running on half a CPU core with 1 gig of memory. So that's fine for demo purposes. But of course, if you're running production workload, you've got thousands of messages, you'd need to figure out, obviously, the correct settings for your resource allocation, but also you need to look at the actual scaling of your logic app as well. So at the moment, I've got one replica with a maximum of one. So again, you need to take into account. And if you were deploying to Azure, native Azure, and you were producing a logic app that you're deploying, you wouldn't just pick the highest app service plan and you wouldn't pick the lowest. You'd have to do some sort of capacity planning and do some testing to make sure that you've got the correct settings and you've got the correct scale settings. So with an app service plan, you might want to have 3 instances of a WS3 running or 3 instances of a WS1. Now you could go straight to the highest and pay a lot of money, but again, you really need to think about your workload and the provisioning of the environment to suit the workload. Don't just deploy it and assume it's going to run in milliseconds. You need to think about your replicas, your scaling, and fundamentally your resource allocation to the logic app container as well. But if you have the correct settings, then yes, it should run as fast as it would do natively in Azure.
Yeah, and ultimately, one of the reasons why you're likely to be doing this is because you want to be running the logic app very close to the things that you're talking to. So
yeah.
Whilst we've got quite a lot of there's the ability to get really good compute performance with containers. You're also running that physically on from a network perspective in a physically close location. So there's that kind of network latency aspect of it as well. So that's why when we looked at back to the start of the why you do this. I mean, okay, there are certain certain industries, for example, airports, have to be able to run on-prem, just because it's those are the rules. But also, if you've got a lot of machinery or something like that maybe in an industrial setting that you want to connect to locally, it's just that being close to those workloads as well. But realistically, if you are just doing normal application integration, you probably just want to set yourself up with an express route from your network and run things in Azure. That's probably by far the simplest and most effective way to do it. But if you've got special cases where you feel like you really want to run on-prem, or you want to run in another cloud, then this is the
Yeah.
solution for that.
The one thing I didn't mention when you mentioned performance, I just thought it's going to be important to note. Assuming you've understood your workload and your capacity, and you've done all of your capacity planning, and you've set the number of replicas, and you've set the number of nodes in your node pool of your Kubernetes cluster, you still need to take into account your SQL Server. So whilst I'm running in SQL Azure and I can scale that, if you've just pointed your local Kubernetes cluster at a very basic SQL instance running on-prem, you will be throttled by that as well and limited by the performance of that. So do take into account not just your Kubernetes cluster, but also if I go back to the diagram, which is in this article here, you do need to take into account your SQL database. Obviously, your file share isn't so much of an issue, but your SQL database, if you've got pretty high load going through your Kubernetes cluster and your Kubernetes cluster can cope with that, you do need to plan around your SQL database. And so you may have a physical tin SQL instance, or you may have a virtual machine. You will need to take the scale of that into account as well.
Yeah, and I think that's fair enough. Like I say, it's just a consideration that needs to go into the planning, because when you run Logic Apps standard in Azure, they write to an Azure storage account, and that is also the limiting factor for performance when they're running in Azure. So that kind of IO based thing is always kind of one of the limiting factors in performance. So all that we've done is we've moved that on this model into SQL Server, whereas in the cloud that would be Azure Storage, but it's still still there. If you've got a right state all the time, then that is going to be potentially a performance bottleneck.
Yeah.
Right, I think we can start to wrap up now. I think the first thing to say is that if you're interested in a demonstration of this, or if you're really interested in moving forward and actually going and planning a hybrid implementation of Logic Apps, possibly to migrate something like a BizTalk workload onto, then please do get in touch. And that would be, you can go to our website, which is 345.technology, or you can just email us at inquiries@345.technologies, and we will get back to you. Be quite happy to carry on a discussion with you on a one-on-one basis and understand what it is you're trying to achieve, and help you replicate this demo. So we'd love to do that. So please do get in touch if you want to do that. And also keep an eye out for our webinars. We're coming into the summer period, so we might have a month or two off whilst everyone's on holiday, but certainly when we come back in the autumn, we'll be all guns blazing, and look forward to continuing to tell this story. This Logic Apps hybrid model's only just gone general availability within the last month, so it's going to move forward quite quickly, and we'll bring you updates on that as soon as they're available. So do you have any closing thoughts, Dave?
No, just on your point about things are moving fast around this. Yeah, keep an eye out for the Azure Integration Services blog, because that has up-to-date information of new items they're releasing. So I talked about the CI/CD. I'm expecting them to publish the approach to that any day soon, but also anything else in terms of new announcements. Keep an eye out for that blog post as well.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I will also post a link to the Azure Integration Services blog in the chat, so you'll be able to pick that up from there. And on that note, I think we will wrap up now. So let's wrap up. So thanks a lot for listening, everyone, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next one. Okay,
Thanks everyone.
bye now.
Bye.